My name is Jeff Morgan. I am hosting Dad Talk today. Eric Carroll, who is normally your host, is not feeling well right now, so he asked me if I would host. So this is my first go-around at this. And with me today, I have a special guest. My guest is Matthew Johnston. Matt and I met about 2 years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was around that time. I had actually seen a YouTube video of you filming a Senate hearing, or I guess a House hearing down in Texas, trying to repeal unilateral no-fault divorce. And so through watching that YouTube video, I tried to contact you and others that were at that hearing, and the rest is history. You and I have been friends since then.
Absolutely. We've been able to see each other probably about half a dozen times. You live in Washington, D.C. I live here in Texas, but we have been able to meet up, went to a conference together. But Matt, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your background and how you got involved in the issue of no-fault divorce?
Sure. So back in, I guess it was 2014, my parents filed for divorce. And initially it was supposed to be a fault-based divorce based on adultery and irretrievable breakdown. However, my father counter sued, and the ground for divorce was no-fault divorce, which we were kind of unfamiliar with at the time. And we figured, well, the merits of each allegation is going to be reviewed by the court. And the more and more time went on, we started to see that, these fault-based grounds for divorce, which, again, there was a cause for action during that time, but the no fault basically was going to trump all of these things. Now, initially that didn't seem like so much of a big deal, but as time went on, to see actually how that process panned out and all the implications that were involved, that was a real eye opener. And so there was one point, I think either right before trial or even right after trial, and my mom kind of stopped and said, what is this no fault thing? And, it seems to be trumping all of my accusations for divorce. And, I don't know how to defend against that. And so at the time I started doing some research. Like I said, I found your video on YouTube. I also found other people here and there that had done some research and written articles about no fault divorce. And it was all still very new to me. And of course, at that time, I knew nothing essentially about our legal system, about American jurisprudence or anything like that. And so it was kind of like in real time, I was learning all of this stuff as quickly as possible. I would stay up till like the wee hours of the night. I mean, like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, trying to understand how all this fits together. And in the course of events, we ended up trying to challenge the constitutionality of no-fault divorce in New York, which was where the divorce was taking place. And unfortunately, there's this doctrine of preservation of issues where you have to, challenge the constitutionality before trial. And unfortunately, we missed that opportunity. But in the course of events, again, I still continue to do research. I still continue to pursue understanding this issue, and looking at other cases around the country that are trying to accomplish the same thing as I am. And so, I understand that this could be a sensitive topic for people, especially if they don't quite understand all the implications. And I try to keep a very objective perspective and dispassionate perspective on this issue, because I understand that divorce, there's all sorts of issues that take place. But looking at it from a very systemic point of view, I've realized how since the 1960s in particular, with the advent of the sexual revolution, that and the explosion of divorce rates in this country, that all of it went back to no-fault divorce, which again, there's also a distinction between unilateral no-fault divorce and mutual no-fault divorce. So in the case of New York, the divorce statute basically says if only one spouse, alleges that the marriage is irretrievably broken, then that's the ground for divorce. And we can kind of unpack that a little bit, but just to point out that key word, one party or one person, makes this a unilateral situation rather than a mutual or a consensual situation.
So before we talk a a little bit more into that, I just want to ask you from your perspective. Here you were, you had been raised in a family that had been mother and father for many years, and then you find out that your parents are getting a divorce. And I guess I want to know how that affected you, how that impacted you. You saw from within what was going on, and people say, well, kids shouldn't take a side, but when you see that one person is responsible for destroying the family, it's almost inevitable that kids will take a side. Is that not correct?
It was certainly the case in my situation. Again, I was raised in a let's say intact family until the age of, I think I was in my early 20s. It was 21, 22 at the time or something like that. And it had been a difficult situation for a number of years. In fact, the majority of my life. But it did reach a kind of breaking point for me, and I struggled a lot with just the family dynamics at home, and a lot of personal issues that arose from that. And so it reached this breaking point that kind of I would say manifested all of the things festering underneath the surface. Which resulted in the beginning of what would become the very long road of divorce.
So you're going through this when you're about 20, 21 years old, and most people say, well, if you're above 18, it doesn't impact you as much. You're an adult right now. Was that true in your case?
So I think there's a misconception about that because oftentimes people think, well, if you're an adult, then it doesn't really matter. It matters significantly, and although there are certainly different dynamics, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's any better than if a child experienced divorce while they were a minor. And I usually put it this way, that and the experience is just different. I would say I put it in these terms, is that think about growing up with your both parents, for 20 years, essentially, right, by the time I was even, out of the house and stuff, going to college. And so I was raised in an intact family all this time, and that's all I've known. And that's all I've built my identity around. And then to have that, taken away, is really devastating because you lose your entire sense of family identity, your past. Right. It's almost like everything that happened before that point just either gets erased or it's just irrelevant because that's the situation, right, you're put in. So, this is not at all to diminish or degrade the experience of minor children who, never know what it's like to have parents, but it is just a different situation, and yet painful and very impactful nonetheless.
You hear many times when you listen to people, it's almost like there's two different lives. There's the life before divorce, the life after divorce. And for children, even 20, 30, 40 years later, or adults, divorce is the defining moment of their childhood or young adulthood, whatever it may be. And we really minimize the impact that this has on children. We just say children are resilient or adults are resilient or something like that. But in many instances, I think you'll agree that it's not that they're resilient. Yes, they may have to deal with just plain crap, what comes out of it, but they're broken and they're silenced. And society is almost forcing them to say, well, if your parents are happy, you'll be happy. And the reality is the kids aren't happy, and it has lifelong impacts on many people. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a really great book out there by Layla Miller, who wrote Primal Loss. I think you may have told me about it. Excellent book. It interviews all these children that had gone through divorce, and they really articulate a lot of the feelings and things, that memories and experiences that they had, that even they want to remain anonymous and not even disclose this to their own family members, because it's just that difficult and that infused into their inner being. And I think that this idea, both from the family court system and from maybe either or both parents, trying to say, well, just learn to leave the past in the past and move on, and just act like everything's okay when it's not. And this is the thing I'd like to kind of hit home on, is that this is a single moment in time, a single action, divorce, but it has eternal consequences. I mean, you're dealing with the ripple effects of this for the rest of your life. And so,
Right.
While it's easy for people to say, in this specific moment, well, okay, now that specific event is now in your past, it really ignores and takes for granted what that does for someone, for the rest of their lives, which is it's just insensitive at the best and just cruel at the worst.
So, the family law attorneys will tell you, well, we've got to get this divorce wrapped up quickly so the kids can get on with their lives. I mean, isn't that, you talked about perverse. Isn't that perverse? We've got to wrap this up quickly so the kids can get on with their lives. You've just destroyed their lives, and now you want them to get on with their lives? The time that they need a mother and a father together is the time that they're being torn apart from one or the other, sometimes both, sometimes from a brother or a sister as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you had a different perspective as well, because after that you were talking about unilateral no-fault divorce and what your mother went through and everything. So your mother, my understanding was that she initially did not want to file for divorce because of her religious belief. She just wanted a separation. She was still hoping for some type of reconciliation. Do I have that correct or not?
Yeah. So, I mean, marriage and divorce policy is on a state-by-state level. So it's not a nationalized system. And so in the case of New York, there were 6 or 7 causes of divorce on the books. And in addition to that, there were causes of separation, which is nowadays quite rare. But New York hadn't updated their family code. And so there was a ground for separation, which again were based on they had desertion or abandonment and also adultery as one of these causes. And so initially, even though she filed for separation and not for divorce. And my father counteracted with that, or countersued for no fault divorce. And so the contention in this particular case had to do with whether she could at least get a separation to provide financial support and protections, but not an actual divorce, or whether they should go with my father's case and go through with divorce and not even have any grounds to doing so. And so in the course of events, no fault trumped everything, and they didn't even consider her grounds